Welcome to Games from Folktales, a podcast that mixes historical research and tabletop role-playing settings. I'm your host, Timothy Ferguson. This week, Ken's Story by Julian Hawthorne for your Monster of the Month. Over to Ben Tucker. Thanks to Ben and to his LibriVox production team.
Section 2 of David Poindexter's Disappearance and Other Tales by Julian Hawthorne. Read by Ben Tucker. Ken's Mystery. One cool October evening, it was the last day of the month, and unusually cool for the time of year, I made up my mind to go and spend an hour or two with my friend Kenningale. Kenningale was an artist, as well as a musical amateur and poet, and had a very delightful studio built onto his house, in which he was wont to sit of an evening. The studio had a cavernous fireplace, designed in imitation of the old-fashioned fireplaces of Elizabethan manor houses, and in it, when the temperature outdoors warranted, he would build up a cheerful fire of dry logs. It would suit me particularly well, I thought, to go and have a quiet pipe and chat in front of that fire with my friend. I had not had such a chat for a very long time, not, in fact, since Kenningale, or Ken as his friends called him, had returned from his visit to Europe the year before. He went abroad, as he affirmed at the time, for purposes of study, whereat we all smiled, for Ken, so far as we knew him, was more likely to do anything else than to study. He was a young fellow of buoyant temperament, lively and social in his habits, of a brilliant and versatile mind, and possessing an income of $12,000 or $15,000 a year. He could sing, play, scribble, and paint very cleverly, and some of his heads and figure pieces were really well done, considering that he never had any regular training in art. But he was not a worker. Personally, he was fine-looking, of good height and figure, active, healthy, and with a remarkably fine brow, and clear, full-gazing eye. Nobody was surprised at his going to Europe. Nobody expected him to do anything there except amuse himself, and few anticipated that he would be soon again seen in New York. He was one of the sort that find Europe agree with them. Off he went, therefore, and in the course of a few months the rumor reached us that he was engaged to a handsome and wealthy New York girl whom he had met in London. This was nearly all we did hear of him until, not very long afterward, he turned up again on Fifth Avenue, to everyone's astonishment. Made no satisfactory answer to those who wanted to know how he happened to tire so soon of the old world, while, as to the reported engagement, he cut short all allusion to that in so peremptory a manner as to show that it was not a permissible topic of conversation with him. It was surmised that the lady had jilted him, but on the other hand she herself returned home not a great while after, and though she had plenty of opportunities, she is never married to this day. Be the rights of that matter what they may, it was soon remarked that Ken was no longer the careless and merry fellow he used to be. On the contrary, he appeared grave, moody, averse from general society, and habitually taciturn and undemonstrative, even in the company of his most intimate friends. Evidently, something had happened to him, or he had done something. What? Had he committed a murder, or joined the Nihilists? Or was his unsuccessful love affair at the bottom of it? Some declared that the cloud was only temporary, and would soon pass away. Nevertheless, up to the period of which I am writing, it had not passed away, but had rather gathered additional gloom, and threatened to become permanent. Meanwhile I had met him twice or thrice at the club, at the opera, or in the street, but had as yet had no opportunity of regularly renewing my acquaintance with him. We had been on a footing of more than common intimacy in the old days, and I was not disposed to think that he would refuse to renew the former relations now. But what I had heard and myself seen of his changed condition imparted a stimulating tinge of suspense or curiosity to the pleasure with which I looked forward to the prospects of this evening. His house stood at a distance of 2 or 3 miles beyond the general range of habitations in New York at this time, and as I walked briskly along in the clear twilight air, I had leisure to go over in my mind all that I had known of Ken, and had divined of his character. After all, had there not always been something in his nature deep down and held in abeyance by the activity of his animal spirits, but something strange and separate, and capable of developing under suitable conditions into what? As I asked myself this question, I arrived at his door, and it was with feeling of relief that I felt the next moment the cordial grasp of his hand, and his voice bidding me welcome in a tone that indicated unaffected gratification at my presence. He drew me at once into the studio, relieved me of my hat and cane, and then put his hand on my shoulder. "I am glad to see you," he repeated with singular earnestness. "Glad to see you and to feel you, and tonight of all nights in the year." "Why tonight especially?" "Oh, never mind. It's just as well, too. You didn't let me know beforehand you were coming. The unreadiness is all, to paraphrase the poet. Now, with you to help me, I can drink a glass of whiskey and water, and take a bit draw of the pipe. This would have been a grim night for me if I had been left to myself." "In such a lap of luxury as this, too," said I, looking round at the glowing fireplace, the low, luxurious chairs, and all the rich and sumptuous fittings of the room. "I should have thought a condemned murderer might make himself comfortable here." "Perhaps, but that's not exactly my category at present. But have you forgotten what night this is? This is November Eve, when, as tradition asserts, the dead arise and walk about, and fairies, goblins, and spiritual beings of all kinds have more freedom and power than on any other day of the year. One can see you've never been in Ireland." "I wasn't aware till now that you had been there either." "Yes, I have been in Ireland. Yes." He paused, sighed, and fell into a reverie from which, however, he soon roused himself by an effort, and went to a cabinet in a corner of the room for the liquor and tobacco. While he was thus employed, I sauntered about the studio, taking note of the various beauties, grotesquenesses, and curiosities that it contained. Many things were there to repay study and arouse admiration, for Ken was a good collector, having excellent taste as well as means to back it. But upon the whole, nothing interested me more than some studies of a female head, roughly done in oils, and judging from the sequestered positions in which I found them, not intended by the artist for exhibition or criticism. There were 3 or 4 of these studies, all of the same face, but in different poses and costumes. In one, the head was enveloped in a dark hood, overshadowing and partly concealing the features. In another, she seemed to be peering duskily through a latticed casement, lit by a faint moonlight. A third showed her splendidly attired in evening costume, with jewels in her hair and ears, and sparkling on her snowy bosom. The expressions were as various as the poses. Now it was demure penetration, now a subtle, inviting glance, now burning passion, and again a look of elfish and elusive mockery. In whatever phrase, the countenance possessed a singular and poignant fascination, not of beauty merely, though that was very striking, but of character and quality likewise. "Did you find this model abroad?" I inquired at length. "She has evidently inspired you, and I don't wonder at it." Ken, who had been mixing the punch and had not noticed my movements, now looked up and said, "I didn't mean those to be seen. They don't satisfy me, and I am going to destroy them. But I couldn't rest till I'd made some attempts to reproduce—" "What was it you asked? Abroad?" "Yes, or no, they were all painted here within the last 6 weeks." "Whether they satisfy you or not, they are by far the best things of yours I have ever seen." "Well, let them alone, and tell me what you think of this beverage. To my thinking, it goes to the right spot. It owes its existence to your coming here. I can't drink alone, and those portraits are not company, though, for aught I know, she might have come out of the canvas tonight and sat down in that chair." Then, seeing my inquiring look, he added with a hasty laugh, "It's November Eve, you know, when anything may happen, provided it's strange enough. Well, here's to ourselves." We each swallowed a deep draught of the smoking and aromatic liquor, and set down our glasses with approval. The punch was excellent. Ken, now opened a box of cigars and we seated ourselves before the fireplace. "All we need now," I remarked after a short silence, "is a little music. By the by, Ken, have you still got the banjo I gave you before you went abroad?" He paused so long before replying that I supposed he had not heard my question. "I have got it," he said at length, "but it will never make any more music." "Got broken, eh? Can't it be mended? It was a fine instrument." "It's not broken, but it's past mending. You shall see for yourself." He arose as he spoke, and going to another part of the studio, opened a black oak coffer, and took out of it a long object wrapped up in a piece of faded yellow silk. He handed it to me, and when I had unwrapped it, there appeared a thing that might once have been a banjo, but had little resemblance to one now. It bore every sign of extreme age. The wood of the handle was honeycombed with the gnawings of worms and dusty with dry rot. The parchment head was green with mold and hung in shriveled tatters. The hoop, which was of solid silver, was so blackened and tarnished that it looked like dilapidated iron. The strings were gone, and most of the tuning screws had dropped out of their decayed sockets. Altogether, it had the appearance of having been made before the flood, and had been forgotten in the forecastle of Noah's Ark ever since. "It is a curious relic, certainly," I said. "Where did you come across it? I had no idea that the banjo was invented so long ago as this. It certainly can't be less than 200 years old, and maybe much older than that." Ken smiled gloomily. "You are quite right," he said. "It is at least 200 years old, and yet it is the very same banjo that you gave me a year ago." "Hardly," I returned, smiling in my turn, "since that was made to my order with a view to presenting it to you." "I know that, but the 200 years have passed since then. Yes, it is absurd and impossible, I know, but nothing is truer. That banjo which was made last year existed in the 16th century, and has been rotting ever since. Stay, give it to me a moment, and I'll convince you. You recollect that your name and mine, with the date, were engraved on the silver hoop?" "Yes, and there was a private mark of my own there also." "Very well," said Ken, who had been rubbing a place on the hoop with the corner of the yellow silk wrapper. "Look at that." I took the decrepit instrument from him, and examined the spot which he had rubbed. It was incredible, sure enough, but there were the names and the date precisely as I had caused them to be engraved, and there moreover was my own private mark, which I had idly made with an old etching point not more than 18 months before. After convincing myself that there was no mistake, I laid the banjo across my knees and stared at my friend in bewilderment. He sat smoking with a kind of grim composure, his eyes fixed upon the blazing logs. "I'm mystified, I confess," said I. "Come, what is the joke? What method have you discovered of producing the decay of centuries on this unfortunate banjo in a few months? And why did you do it? I have heard of an elixir to counteract the effects of time, but your recipe seems to work the other way, to make time rush forward at 200 times his usual rate, in one place, while he jogs on at his usual gait elsewhere. Unfold your mystery, magician. Seriously, Ken, how on earth did the thing happen?" "I know no more about it than you do," was his reply. "Either you and I and all the rest of the living world are insane, or else there has been wrought a miracle as strange as any in tradition. How can I explain it? It is a common saying, a common experience, if you will, that we may, on certain trying or tremendous occasions, live years in one moment. But there's a mental experience, not a physical one, and one that applies at all events only to human beings, not to senseless things of wood and metal. You imagine the thing is some trickery or jugglery. If it be, I don't know the secret of it. There's no chemical appliance that I ever heard of that will get a piece of solid wood into that condition in a few months, or a few years. And it wasn't done in a few years, or a few months either. A year ago today, at this very hour, that banjo was as sound as when it left the maker's hands. And 24 hours afterward, I'm telling you the simple truth, it was as you see it now." The gravity and earnestness with which Ken made this astounding statement were evidently not assumed. He believed every word that he uttered. I knew not what to think. Of course my friend might be insane, though he betrayed none of the ordinary symptoms of mania. But however that might be, there was the banjo, a witness whose silent testimony there was no gainsaying. The more I meditated on the matter, the more inconceivable did it appear. 200 years. 24 hours. These were the terms of the proposed equation. Kin and the banjo both affirmed that the equation had been made. All worldly knowledge and experience affirmed it to be impossible. What was the explanation? What is time? What is life? I felt myself beginning to doubt the reality of all things. And so this was the mystery which my friend had been brooding over since his return from abroad. No wonder it had changed him. More to be wondered at was it that it had not changed him more. "Can you tell me the whole story?" I demanded at length. Ken quaffed another draught from his glass of whiskey and water and rubbed his hand through his thick brown beard. "I have never spoken to anyone of it heretofore," he said, "and I had never meant to speak of it. But I'll try and give you some idea of what it was. You know me better than anyone else. You'll understand the thing as far as it can ever be understood, and perhaps I may be relieved of some of the oppression it has caused me. For it is rather a ghastly memory to grapple with alone, I can tell you." Hereupon, without further preface, Ken related the following tale. He was, I may observe in passing, a naturally fine narrator. There were deep, lingering tones in his voice, and he could strikingly enhance the comic or pathetic effect of a sentence by dwelling here and there upon some syllable. His features were equally susceptible of humorous and of solemn expressions, and his eyes were in form and hue wonderfully adapted to showing great varieties of emotion. Their mournful aspect was extremely earnest and affecting, and when Ken was giving utterance to some mysterious passage of the tale, they had a doubtful, melancholy, exploring look which appealed irresistibly to the imagination. But the interest of his story was too pressing to allow of noticing these incidental embellishments at the time, though they doubtless had their influence upon me all the same. "I left New York on an Inman Line steamer, you remember," began Ken, "and landed at Havre. I went the usual round of sightseeing on the continent, and got round to London in July at the height of the season. I had good introductions, and met any number of agreeable and famous people. Among others was a young lady, a countrywoman of my own, you know whom I mean, who interested me very much, and before her family left London, she and I were engaged. We parted there for the time, because she had the continental trip still to make, while I wanted to take the opportunity to visit the north of England and Ireland. I landed at Dublin about the 1st of October, and zigzagging about the country I found myself in County Cork about 2 weeks later. There is in that region some of the most lovely scenery that human eyes ever rested on, and it seemed to be less known to tourists than many places of infinitely less picturesque value. A lonely region, too. During my rambles I met not a single stranger like myself, and few enough natives. It seems incredible that so beautiful a country should be so deserted. After walking a dozen Irish miles, you come across a group of 2 or 3 one-roomed cottages, and like as not, one or more of those will have the roof off and the walls in ruins. The few peasants whom one sees, however, are affable and hospitable, especially when they hear you are from that terrestrial heaven whither most of their friends and relatives have gone before them. They seem simple and primitive enough at first sight, and yet they are as strange and incomprehensible a race as any in the world. They are as superstitious, as credulous of marvels, fairies, magicians, and omens as the men whom St. Patrick preached to. And at the same time, they are shrewd, skeptical, sensible, and bottomless liars. Upon the whole, I met with no nation on my travels whose company I enjoyed so much, or who inspired me with so much kindliness, curiosity, and repugnance. At length I got to a place on the sea-coast, which I will not further specify than to say that it is not many miles from Ballymaceen, on the south shore. I have seen Venice and Naples. I have driven along the Cornice road. I have spent a month at our own Mount Desert, and I say that all of them together are not so beautiful as this glowing, deep-hued, soft-gleaming, silvery-lighted, ancient harbor and town, with the tall hills crowding round it, and the black cliffs and headlands planting their iron feet in the blue transparent sea. It is a very old place, and has had a history which it has outlived ages since. It may once have had 2,000 or 3,000 inhabitants. It has scarce 500 or 600 today. Half the houses are in ruins or have disappeared. Many of the remainder are standing empty. All the people are poor, most of them abjectly so. They saunter about with bare feet and uncovered heads, the women in quaint black or dark blue cloaks, the men in such anomalous attire as only an Irishman knows how to get together, the children half naked. The only comfortable-looking people are the monks and the priests, and the soldiers in the fort, for there is a fort there, constructed on the huge ruins of one which may have done duty in the reign of Edward the Black Prince or earlier, in whose mossy embrasures are mounted a couple of cannon, which occasionally sent a practice shot or two at the cliff on the other side of the harbor. The garrison consists of 12 men and 3 or 4 officers and non-commissioned officers. I suppose they are relieved occasionally, but those I saw seem to have become component parts of their surroundings. I put up at a wonderful little old inn, the only one in the place, and took my meals in a dining saloon 15 feet by 9, with a portrait of George I, a print varnished to preserve it, hanging over the mantelpiece. On the second evening after dinner a young gentleman came in, the dining saloon being public property, of course, and ordered some bread and cheese and a bottle of Dublin stout. We presently fell into talk. He turned out to be an officer from the fort, Lieutenant O'Connor, and a fine young specimen of the Irish soldier he was. After telling me all he knew about the town, the surrounding country, his friends, and himself, he intimated a readiness to sympathize with whatever tale I might choose to pour into his ear, and I had pleasure in trying to rival his own outspokenness. We became excellent friends. We had up a half-pint of Kinahan's whiskey, and the lieutenant expressed himself in terms of high praise of my countrymen, my country, and my own particular cigars. When it became time for him to depart, I accompanied him, for there was a splendid moon abroad, and bade him farewell at the fort entrance, having promised to come over the next day, and make the acquaintance of the other fellows. "And mind your eye now, going back, my dear boy," he called out as I turned my face homeward. "Faith, 'tis a spooky place, that graveyard, and you'll as likely meet the Black Woman there as anywhere else." The graveyard was a forlorn and barren spot on the hillside, just the hither side of the fort. 30 or 40 rough headstones, few of which retained any semblance of the perpendicular, while many were so shattered and decayed as to seem nothing more than irregular natural projections from the ground. Who the Black Woman might be I knew not, and did not stay to inquire. I had never been subject to ghostly apprehensions, and, as a matter of fact, though the path I had to follow was in places very bad going, not to mention a haphazard scramble over a ruined bridge that covered a deep-lying brook, I reached my inn without any adventure whatever. The next day I kept my appointment at the fort, and found no reason to regret it, and my friendly sentiments were abundantly reciprocated, thanks more especially perhaps to the success of my banjo, which I carried with me, and which was as novel as it was popular with those who listened to it. The chief personages in the social circle besides my friend, the lieutenant, were Major Malloy, who was in command, a racy and juicy old campaigner with a face like a sunset, and the surgeon, Dr. Judine, a long, dry, humorous genius, with a wealth of anecdotal and traditional lore at his command that I have never seen surpassed. We had a jolly time of it, and it was the precursor of many more like it. The remains of October slipped away rapidly, and I was obliged to remember that I was a traveler in Europe, and not a resident in Ireland. The major, the surgeon, and the lieutenant all protested cordially against my proposed departure, but as there was no help for it, they arranged a farewell dinner to take place in the fort on All Halloween. I wish you could have been at that dinner with me. It was the essence of Irish good fellowship. Dr. Judine was in great force. The major was better than the best of Lever's novels. The lieutenant was overflowing with hearty good humor, merry chaff, and sentimental rhapsodies anent this or the other pretty girl of the neighborhood. For my part, I made the banjo ring as it had never rung before, and the others joined in the chorus with a mellow strength of lungs such as you don't often hear outside of Ireland. Among the stories that Dr. Judine regaled us with was one about the Kern of Queren, and his wife, Ethelind Fiongwalla, which, being interpreted, signifies the white-shouldered. The lady, it appears, was originally betrothed to one O'Connor. Here the lieutenant smacked his lips. But was stolen away on the wedding night by a party of vampires, who, it would seem, were at the period a prominent feature among the troubles of Ireland. But as they were bearing her along, she being unconscious, to that supper where she was not to eat but to be eaten, the young kern of Quarren, who happened to be out duck-shooting, met the party, and emptied his gun at it. The vampires fled, and the kern carried the fair lady, still in a state of insensibility, to his house. "And by the same token, Mr. Cunningill," observed the doctor, knocking the ashes out of his pipe, "you're after passing that very house on your way here, the one with the dark archway underneath it, and the big mullioned window at the corner. You recollect, hanging over the street, as I might see." "Go along with the house, Dr. Ludine, dear," interrupted the lieutenant. "Sure, can't you see we're all dying to know what happened to sweet Miss Fiongala, God be good to her, when I was after getting her safe upstairs?" "Faith, then I can tell ye that myself, Mr. O'Connor," exclaimed the mayor, imparting a rotary motion to the remnants of whiskey in his tumbler. "'Tis a question to be solved on general principles, as Colonel O'Halloran said that time he was asked what he'd do if he'd been the Duke of Wellington, and the Prussians hadn't come up in the nick of time at Waterloo. Faith, says the colonel, I'll tell ye. Hurrah then, Mayor, why would you be interrupting the doctor and Mr. Cunningill there, letting his glass stay empty till he hears, the Lord save us, the bottle's empty? In the excitement consequent upon this discovery, the thread of the doctor's story was lost, and before it could be recovered the evening had advanced so far that I felt obliged to withdraw. It took some time to make my proposition heard and comprehended, and a still longer time to put it in execution, so that it was fully midnight before I found myself standing in the cool, pure air outside the fort, with the farewells of my boon companions ringing in my ears. Considering that it had been a rather wet evening indoors, I was in a remarkably good state of preservation, and I therefore ascribed it rather to the roughness of the road than to the smoothness of the liquor, when after advancing a few rods, I stumbled and fell. As I picked myself up, I fancied I had heard a laugh, and supposed that the lieutenant, who had accompanied me to the gate, was making merry over my mishap. But on looking round, I saw that the gate was closed, and no one was visible. The laugh, moreover, had seemed to be close at hand, and to be even pitched in a key that was rather feminine than masculine. Of course, I must have been deceived. Nobody was near me. My imagination had played me a trick, or else there was more truth than poetry in the tradition that Halloween is the carnival time of disembodied spirits. It did not occur to me at the time that a stumble is held by the superstitious Irish to be an evil omen, and had I remembered it, it would only have been to laugh at it. At all events, I was physically none the worse for my fall, and I resumed my way immediately. But the path was singularly difficult to find, or rather, the path I was following did not seem to be the right one. I did not recognize it. I could have sworn, except I knew the contrary, that I had never seen it before. The moon had risen, though her light was as yet obscured by clouds. But neither my immediate surroundings nor the general aspect of the region appeared familiar. Dark, silent hillsides mounted up on either hand, and the road, for the most part, plunged downward, as if to conduct me into the bowels of the earth. The place was alive with strange echoes, so that at times I seemed to be walking through the midst of muttering voices and mysterious whispers, and wild, faint sound of laughter seemed ever and anon to reverberate among the passes of the hills. Currents of colder air, sighing up through narrow defiles and dark crevices, touched my face as with airy fingers. A certain feeling of anxiety and insecurity began to take possession of me, though there was no definable cause for it, unless that I might be belated in getting home. With the perverse instinct of those who are lost, I hastened my steps, but was impelled now and then to glance back over my shoulder with a sensation of being pursued. But no living creature was in sight. The moon, however, had now risen higher, and the clouds that were drifting slowly across the sky, flung into the naked valley, dusky shadows, which occasionally assumed shapes that looked like the vague semblance of gigantic human forms. How long had I been hurrying onward, I know not, when, with a kind of suddenness, I found myself approaching a graveyard. It was situated on the spur of a hill, and there was no fence around it, nor anything to protect it from the incursions of passers-by. There was something in the general appearance of this spot that made me half fancy I had seen it before, and I should have taken it to be the same that I had often noticed on my way to the fort, but that the latter was only a few hundred yards distant therefrom, whereas I must have traversed several miles at least. As I drew near, moreover, I observed that the headstones did not appear so ancient and decayed as those of the other. But what chiefly attracted my attention was the figure that was leaning or half-sitting upon one of the largest of the upright slabs near the road. It was a female figure, draped in black, and a closer inspection, for I was soon within a few yards of her, showed that she wore the kala, or long-hooded cloak, the most common as well as the most ancient garment of Irish women, and doubtless of Spanish origin. I was a trifle startled by this apparition, so unexpected as it was, and so strange did it seem that any human creature should be at that hour of the night in so desolate and sinister a place. Involuntarily I paused as I came opposite her, and gazed at her intently. But the moonlight fell behind her, and the deep hood of her cloak so completely shadowed her face that I was unable to discern anything but the spark of a pair of eyes, which appeared to be returning my gaze with much vivacity. "You seem to be at home here," I said at length. "Can you tell me where I am?" Hereupon the mysterious personage broke into a light laugh, which, though in itself musical and agreeable, was of a timbre and intonation that caused my heart to beat rather faster than my late pedestrian exertions warranted, for it was the identical laugh, or so my imagination persuaded me, that had echoed in my ears as I rose from my tumble an hour or two ago. For the rest, it was the laugh of a young woman, and presumably of a pretty one, and yet it had a wild, airy, mocking quality that seemed hardly human at all, or not, at any rate, characteristic of a being of affections and limitations like unto ours. But this impression of mine was fostered, no doubt, by the unusual and uncanny circumstances of the occasion. "Sure, sir," said she, "you're at the grave of Ethelyn Fionnghuala." As she spoke, she rose to her feet and pointed to the inscription on the stone. I bent forward and was able, without much difficulty, to decipher the name and a date which indicated that the occupant of the grave must have entered the disembodied state between 2 and 3 centuries ago. "And who are you?" was my next question. "I'm called Elsie," she replied. "But where would your honour be going November Eve?" I mentioned my destination and asked her whether she could direct me thither. "Indeed, then, 'tis there I'm going myself," Elsie replied. "And if your honour will follow me, and play me a tune on the pretty instrument, 'tisn't long we'll be on the road." She pointed to the banjo which I carried, wrapped up under my arm. How she knew that it was a musical instrument I could not imagine. Possibly I thought she may have seen me playing on it as I strolled about the environs of the town. Be that as it may, I offered no opposition to the bargain, and further intimated that I would reward her more substantially on our arrival. At that she laughed again and made a peculiar gesture with her hand above her head. I uncovered my banjo, swept my fingers across the strings, and struck into a fantastic dance measure, to the music of which we proceeded along the path, Elsie slightly in advance, her feet keeping time to the airy measure. In fact, she trod so lightly, with an elastic, undulating movement, that with a little more it seemed as if she might float onward like a spirit. The extreme whiteness of her feet attracted my eye, and I was surprised to find that instead of being bare, as I had supposed, these were encased in white satin slippers, quaintly embroidered with gold thread. "Elsie," said I, lengthening my steps so as to come up with her, "where do you live, and what do you do for a living?" "Sure, I live by myself," she answered. and if you'd be after knowing how, you must come and see for yourself." "Are you in the habit of walking over the hills at night in shoes like that?" "And why would I not?" she asked in her turn. "And where did your honour get the pretty gold ring on your finger?" The ring, which was of no great intrinsic value, had struck my eye in an old curiosity shop in Cork. It was an antique of very old-fashioned design, and might have belonged, as the vendor assured me was the case, to one of the early kings or queens of Ireland. "Do you like it?" said I. "Will your honour be after making a present of it to Elsie?" she returned, with an insinuating tone and turn of the head. "Maybe I will, Elsie, on one condition. I am an artist. I make pictures of people. If you will promise to come to my studio and let me paint your portrait, I'll give you the ring, and some money besides." "And will you give me the ring now?" said Elsie. "Yes, if you'll promise." "And will you play the music to me?" she continued. "As much as you like." "But maybe I'll not be handsome enough for ye," said she, with a glance of her eyes beneath the dark hood. "I'll take the risk of that," I answered, laughing, "though all the same I don't mind taking a peep beforehand to remember you by." So saying, I put forth a hand to draw back the concealing hood. But Elsie eluded me, I scarce know how, and laughed a third time with the same airy, mocking cadence. "Give me the ring first, and then you shall see me," she said coaxingly. "Stretch out your hand, then," returned I, removing the ring from my finger. "When we are better acquainted, Elsie, you won't be suspicious." She held out a slender, delicate hand, on the forefinger of which I slipped the ring. As I did so, the folds of her cloak fell a little apart, affording me a glimpse of a white shoulder and of a dress that seemed in that deceptive semi-darkness to be wrought of rich and costly material. And I caught, too, or so I fancied, the frosty sparkle of precious stones. "Arrah, mind where you tread," said Elsie in a sudden sharp tone. I looked round and became aware for the first time that we were standing near the middle of a ruined bridge which spanned a rapid stream that flowed at a considerable depth below. The parapet of the bridge on one side was broken down, and I must have been, in fact, in imminent danger of stepping over into empty air. I made my way cautiously across the decaying structure, but when I turned to assist Elsie, she was nowhere to be seen. What had become of the girl? I called, but no answer came. I gazed about on every side, but no trace of her was visible. Unless she had plunged into the narrow abyss at my feet, there was no place where she could have concealed herself. None, at least, that I could discover. She had vanished, nevertheless, and since her disappearance must have been premeditated, I finally came to the conclusion that it was useless to attempt to find her. She would present herself again in her own good time, or not at all. She had given me the slip very cleverly, and I must make the best of it. The adventure was perhaps worth the ring. On resuming my way, I was not a little relieved to find that I once more knew where I was. The bridge that I had just crossed was none other than the one I mentioned some time back. I was within a mile of the town, and my way lay clear before me. The moon, moreover, had now quite dispersed the clouds and shone down with exquisite brilliance. Whatever her other failings, Elsie had been a trustworthy guide. She brought me out of the depth of Elfland into the material world again. It had been a singular adventure, certainly, and I mused over it with a sense of mysterious pleasure as I sauntered along, humming snatches of airs and accompanying myself on the strings. Hark! What light step was that behind me? It sounded like Elsie's, but no, Elsie was not there. The same impression or hallucination, however, recurred several times before I reached the outskirts of the town. The tread of an airy footfall behind or beside my own. The fancy did not make me nervous. On the contrary, I was pleased with the notion of being thus haunted, and gave myself up to a romantic and genial vein of reverie. After passing one or two roofless and moss-grown cottages, I entered the narrow and rambling street which leads through the town. This street, a short distance down, widens a little as if to afford the wayfarer space to observe a remarkable old house that stands on the northern side. The house was built of stone, and in a noble style of architecture. It reminds me somewhat of certain palaces of the old Italian nobility that I had seen on the continent, and it may very probably have been built by one of the Italian or Spanish immigrants of the 16th or 17th century. The molding of the projecting windows and arched doorway was richly carved, and upon the front of the building was an escutcheon wrought in high relief, though I could not make out the purport of the device. The moonlight falling upon the picturesque pile enhanced all its beauties, and at the same time made it seem like a vision that might dissolve away when the light ceased to shine. I must often have seen the house before, and yet I retained no definite recollection of it. I had never until now examined it with my eyes open, so to speak. Leaning against the wall on the opposite side of the street, I contemplated it for a long while at my leisure. The window at the corner was really a very fine, massive affair. It projected over the pavement below, throwing a heavy shadow aslant. The frames of the diamond-paned lattices were heavily mullioned. How often in past ages had that lattice been pushed open by some fair hand, revealing to a lover, waiting beneath in the moonlight, the charming countenance of his high-born mistress. Those were the brave days. They had passed away long since. The great house had stood empty for who could tell how many years. Only bats and vermin were its inhabitants. Where now were those who had built it? And who were they? Probably the very name of them was forgotten. As I continued to stare upward, however, a conjecture presented itself to my mind, which rapidly ripened into a conviction. Was this not the house that Dr. Dudeen had described that very evening as having been formerly the abode of the Kern of Queren and his mysterious bride? There was the projecting window, the arched doorway. Yes, beyond a doubt, this was the very house. I emitted a low exclamation of renewed interest and pleasure, and my speculations took a still more imaginative but also a more definite turn. What had been the fate of that lovely lady after the Kern had brought her home insensible in his arms? Did she recover, and were they married and made happy ever after, or had the sequel been a tragic one? I remembered to have read that the victims of vampires generally became vampires themselves. Then my thoughts went back to that grave on the hillside. Surely that was unconsecrated ground. Why had they buried her there? Ethelind of the White Shoulder. Ah, why had I not lived in those days, or why might not some magic cause them to live again for me? Then would I seek this street at midnight, and standing here beneath her window, I would lightly touch the strings of my bandour until the casement opened cautiously and she looked down. A sweet vision indeed! And what prevented my realizing it? Only a matter of a couple of centuries or so. And was my time, then, at which poets and philosophers sneer, so rigid and real a matter that a little faith and imagination might not overcome it? At all events, I had my banjo, the bandour's legitimate and lineal descendant, and the memory of Fianguala should have the love ditty. Hereupon, having retuned the instrument, I launched forth into an old Spanish love song, which I had met with in some mouldy library during my travels, and had set to music of my own. I sang low, for the deserted street re-echoed the lightest sound, and what I sang must reach only my lady's ears. The words were warm with the fire of the ancient Spanish chivalry, and I threw into their expression all the passion of the lovers of romance. Surely, Fianguala, the white-shouldered, would hear, and awaken from her sleep of centuries, and come to the latticed casement, and look down. Hist! See yonder! What light! What shadow is that seems to flit from room to room within the abandoned house, and now approaches the mullioned window? Are my eyes dazzled by the play of the moonlight, or does the casement move? Does it open? Nay, this is no delusion. There is no error of the senses here. There is simply a woman, young, beautiful, and richly attired, bending forward from the window, and silently beckoning me to approach. Too much amazed to be conscious of amazement, I advanced until I stood directly beneath the casement, and the lady's face, as she stooped towards me, was not more than twice a man's height from my own. She smiled and kissed her fingertips. Something white fluttered in her hand, then fell through the air to the ground at my feet. The next moment she had withdrawn, and I heard the lattice close. I picked up what she had let fall. It was a delicate lace handkerchief tied to the handle of an elaborately wrought bronze key. It was evidently the key of the house, and invited me to enter. I loosened it from the handkerchief, which bore a faint, delicious perfume, like the aroma of flowers in an ancient garden, and turned to the arched doorway. I felt no misgiving, and scarcely any sense of strangeness. All was as I had wished it to be, and as it should be. The medieval age was alive once more. And as for myself, I almost felt the velvet cloak hanging from my shoulder, and the long rapier dangling at my belt. Standing in front of the door, I thrust the key into the lock, turned it, and felt the bolt yield. The next instant the door was open, apparently from within. I stepped across the threshold. The door closed again, and I was alone in the house, and in darkness. Not alone, however. As I extended my hand to grope my way, it was met by another hand, soft, slender, and cold, which insinuated itself gently into mine and drew me forward. Forward I went, nothing loath. The darkness was impenetrable, but I could hear the light rustle of a dress close to me, and the same delicious perfume that had emanated from the handkerchief enriched the air that I breathed, while the little hand that clasped and was clasped by my own alternately tightened and half relaxed the hold of its soft, cold fingers. In this manner, and treading lightly, we traversed what I presumed to be a long, irregular passageway, and ascended a staircase, then another corridor, until finally we paused. A door opened, emitting a flood of soft light, into which we entered, still hand in hand. The darkness and the doubt were at an end. The room was of imposing dimensions, and was furnished and decorated in a style of antique splendor. The walls were draped with mellow hues of tapestry. Clusters of candles burned in polished silver sconces, and were reflected and multiplied in tall mirrors placed in the four corners of the room. The heavy beams of the dark oaken ceiling crossed each other in squares, and were laboriously carved. The curtains and the drapery of the chairs were of heavy figured damask. At one end of the room was a broad ottoman, and in front of it a table, on which was set forth in massive silver dishes a sumptuous repast, with wines and crystal beakers. At the side was a vast and deep fireplace, with space enough on the broad hearth to burn whole trunks of trees. No fire, however, was there, but only a great heap of dead embers. And the room, for all its magnificence, was cold. Cold as a tomb, or as my lady's hand, and it sent a subtle chill creeping to my heart. But my lady, how fair she was! I gave but a passing glance at the room. My eyes and my thoughts were all for her. She was dressed in white, like a bride. Diamonds sparkled in her dark hair and on her snowy bosom. Her lovely face and slender lips were pale, and all the paler for the dusky glow of her eyes. She gazed at me with a strange, elusive smile, and yet there was in her aspect and bearing something familiar in the midst of strangeness, like the burden of a song heard long ago and recalled among other conditions and surroundings. It seemed to me that something in me recognized her and knew her, had known her always. She was the woman of whom I had dreamed, whom I had beheld in visions, whose voice and face had haunted me from boyhood up. Whether we had ever met before as human beings meet, I knew not. Perhaps I had been blindly seeking her all over the world, and she had been awaiting me in this splendid room, sitting by those dead embers until all the warmth had gone out of her blood, only to be restored by the heat with which my love might supply her. "I thought you had forgotten me," she said, nodding as if in answer to my thought. "The night was so late, our one night of the year. How my heart rejoiced when I heard your dear voice singing the song I know so well. Kiss me, my lips are cold." Cold indeed they were, cold as the lips of death. But the warmth of my own seemed to revive them. They were now tinged with a faint color, and in her cheeks also appeared a delicate shade of pink. She drew fuller breath, as one who recovers from a long lethargy. Was it my life that was feeding her? I was ready to give her all. She drew me to the table and pointed to the viands and the wine. "Eat and drink," she said. "You have traveled far, and you need food." "Will you eat and drink with me?" said I, pouring out the wine. "You are the only nourishment I want," was her answer. "This wine is thin and cold. Give me wine as red as your blood and as warm, and I will drain a goblet to the dregs." At these words, I know not why, a slight shiver passed through me. She seemed to gain vitality and strength at every instant, but the chill of the great room struck into me more and more. She broke into a fantastic flow of spirits, clapping her hands and dancing about me like a child. Who was she? And was I myself, or was she mocking me when she implied that we had belonged to each other of old? At length she stood still before me, crossing her hands over her breast. I saw upon the forefinger of her right hand the gleam of an antique ring. "Where did you get that ring?" I demanded. She shook her head and laughed. "Have you been faithful?" she asked. "It is my ring. It is the ring that unites us. It is the ring that you gave me when you loved me first. It is the ring of the Kern, the fairy ring, and I am your Ethelind Fiongwala." "So be it," I said, casting aside all doubt and fear and yielding myself wholly to the spell of her inscrutable eyes and wooing lips. "You are mine, and I am yours, and let us be happy while the hours last." "You are mine, and I am yours," she repeated, nodding her head with an elfish smile. "Come and sit beside me, and sing that sweet song again that you sang to me so long ago. Ah, now I shall live 100 years. We seated ourselves on the ottoman, and while she nestled luxuriously among the cushions, I took my banjo and sang to her. The song and the music resounded through the lofty room and came back in throbbing echoes. And before me, as I sang, I saw the face and form of Ethelind Fiongwala, in her jeweled bridal dress, gazing at me with burning eyes. She was pale no longer, but ruddy and warm, and life was like a flame within her. It was I who had become cold and bloodless. Yet with the last life that was in me, I would have sung to her of love that can never die. But at length my eyes grew dim. The room seemed to darken. The form of Ethelind alternately brightened and waxed indistinct, like the last flickerings of a fire. I swayed toward her and felt myself lapsing into unconsciousness, with my head resting on her white shoulder. Here Kinningale paused a few moments in his story, flung a fresh log upon the fire, and then continued. I awoke I know not how long afterward. I was in a vast empty room in a ruined building. Rotten shreds of drapery depended from the walls, and heavy festoons of spiders' webs, gray with dust, covered the windows, which were destitute of glass or sash. They had been boarded up with rough planks, which had themselves become rotten with age, and admitted through their holes and crevices pallid rays of light and chilly draughts of air. A bat, disturbed by these rays or by my own movement, detached himself from his hold on a remnant of moldy tapestry near me, and after circling dizzily around my head, wheeled the flickering noiselessness of his flight into a darker corner. As I rose unsteadily from the heap of miscellaneous rubbish on which I had been lying, something which had been resting across my knees fell to the floor with a rattle. I picked it up and found it to be my banjo, as you see it now. Well, that is all I have to tell. My health was seriously impaired. All the blood seemed to have been drawn out of my veins. I was pale and haggard, and the chill... Oh, that chill, murmured Kinningale, drawing nearer to the fire, and spreading out his hands to catch the warmth. I shall never get over it. I shall carry it to my grave.